Imagine the floor beneath you just suddenly drops out. In a matter of seconds, the ceiling collapses, the walls cave in, and the world as you know it is entirely gone.
Just completely wiped out.
Right. There are no rules anymore. There's no emergency rescue coming over the horizon. There is just rubble, dust, and silence.
It's a terrifying scenario.
It really is. And if you were standing on the ruins of your own life, how long would it take for the polite, modern version of you to vanish entirely? Like, what parts of your cultured self would be the very first to disappear?
You know, it is a terrifying thought experiment, isn't it? Because we all like to believe that our values or manners, our deep emotional complexities are hardwired into who we are.
Oh, totally. We think we'd be noble.
Exactly. We think of them as our core operating system. But the reality, which we're going to explore today, suggests something far, far more unsettling.
And that is exactly what we're getting into. We have a massive stack of notes, excerpts, and research centered around a deeply provocative investigation from Manu Joseph's book, Why the Poor Don't Kill Us.
A fascinating read.
Truly. And the mission of our deep dive today is to explore a profound and, frankly, highly uncomfortable mystery. In a region, specifically India, marked by some of the most extreme visible inequality on the planet, where staggering wealth and absolute crushing destitution live right next to each other, why is there peace?
Right. It's a huge question.
Why doesn't the sheer friction of that inequality spark a constant burning revolt? We're thrilled you're joining us for this, because this isn't just some boring sociology lesson.
Not at all.
This is going to flip everything you assume about human nature completely upside down.
It really does force a total reevaluation of how society functions. I mean, the framework we are looking at contrasts two states of being that seem entirely different on the surface, but they actually share the exact same behavioral DNA.
Right.
We are going to look at the raw, almost terrifying pragmatism of people who have just survived a massive natural disaster, and we're going to compare that to the everyday reality of the modern poor.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the material begins with a very specific, visceral moment in time.
It does. It starts on the morning of January 26, 2001. A massive earthquake struck western India, completely devastating places like Bhuj, Anjar, and Gandham.
Just absolute destruction.
Absolute. And the author of our source material was actually there. He arrived roughly 20 hours after the quake hit, right near the epicenter.
Oh, wow. So he was right in the thick of it.
Yeah, right in the critical window before the army has fully mobilized, before the international rescue operations have set up their tents and cameras. It's just the survivors and the rubble.
Just utter chaos.
And what he witnessed in those early hours completely shattered our conventional modern expectations of how grief is supposed to look.
Right, because we are conditioned mostly by movies and literature, I guess, to expect weeping. We expect paralysis.
Yes, the dramatic performance of mourning.
Exactly, where someone falls to their knees and curses the sky. But that isn't what happened.
Not at all. The very first person the author encounters is a man standing on top of a massive mound of debris. That debris used to be his home. It had completely sunk into its foundation.
That's horrifying.
And trapped underneath the rubble, directly beneath this man's feet, are his wife and children.
Oh my God.
And he can actually hear them occasionally calling out for help and then falling silent for agonizingly long stretches.
I can't even fathom the psychological weight of that moment.
It's unbearable. The author, who was 25 years old at the time, is just paralyzed by the sheer horror of it. He doesn't even know how to approach or speak to a man in that level of hell.
I wouldn't either. What do you even say?
Right. So, deciding to give the man space, the author tunes to a random bystander nearby to ask for directions to a medical camp.
And this is the moment that completely breaks your brain. What does the man standing on the rubble do?
He interrupts the conversation to give the directions himself.
Wait, what?
Yeah. And not just a vague point of the finger. He gives elaborate, incredibly precise directions, pointing out exactly where to turn left, where to turn right. He's acting almost like a composed traffic cop directing a tourist.
That's insane.
And once he finishes giving these meticulous directions, he just goes back to standing there on the rubble. As the author notes, he looked like a man calmly waiting for a bus.
It's jarring. It feels wrong to us, just hearing it. But it gets even more surreal as the days go on. The author is traveling through the disaster zone with a photographer, and they keep getting approached by local men who want the photographer to take pictures of their dead wives.
Yeah, that part is really striking.
And you'd think, okay, this is a desperate attempt to preserve a memory, right? But it wasn't for sentimental reasons at all.
No, it was purely administrative.
Administrative.
Yes. These men had instantly realized that in a natural calamity of this scale, the local government bureaucracy was going to collapse. A press photograph taken by a journalist functions as an undeniable death certificate.
Wow.
If they possess that photo, they can legally prove your wife is dead, which allows them to remarry or settle local affairs.
That is so cold, but also so logical.
Others were demanding photos of their dead parents specifically to settle property disputes before the land got seized or contested by neighbors.
There was even a guy who flagged them down at a mass cremation site. He literally asked to be photographed standing against the backdrop of his brother's burning pyre.
Unbelievable.
And why? Because he had to prove his brother was dead to claim his inheritance, and a photo of the fire was the only proof he could secure before the ashes blew away.
What's fascinating here is the sheer velocity of this cognitive pivot. Once the initial shock registers, the human brain in these environments snaps instantly to logistics.
Right. What to do next?
Exactly. The text details another scene in Anjar, a town where over 400 children died when a school collapsed. There's a man sitting on a tilted, broken cupboard that's resting on the rubble.
Okay.
Underneath that rubble is the crushed, lifeless body of his 16-year-old brother. And what is the man doing? He is actively hacking away at the cupboard with a knife, trying to pry it open to extract jewels, cash, and perfume bottles before the army arrives to cordon off and take control of the site.
He's literally mining his own tragedy before the state can lock him out of it.
Yes. A soldier who was watching this unfold told the author that he was deeply disturbed by the mass behavior he was seeing.
I bet.
But the soldier observed a brutal truth. Once these people realize their family is dead, they skip the mourning period and immediately think of what to do next.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because on the surface, that sounds wildly callous.
It does.
When we hear about a man demanding a photo of a corpse to settle a will, or, and this is a really tough image, from the material someone using a dead woman's body in a ditch as a stepping stone because someone helpfully placed a large rock on her chest to help people cross over.
Just a horrific image.
We immediately want to judge that. We want to say, how could they? But I keep thinking about this in terms of technology. Have you ever had a computer completely crash because it was running too many heavy programs?
Oh, of course. Everything freezes and you have to force a restart.
Right. And when the system is totally overwhelmed, it reboots in safe mode. It force quits all the background apps.
That's a great analogy.
In this scenario, manners, cultural expectations, the performance of grief, philosophical debates about the sanctity of a body, those are all high-energy background apps.
They're luxuries.
Exactly. The earthquake force quits all of them. The human brain reboots in safe mode, running only the absolute essential operating system required for literal physical survival today.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The author describes this exact phenomenon as feral pragmatism.
Feral pragmatism.
It is crucial to understand that these people had not suddenly become evil or sociopathic or fundamentally broken. What happened was that the catastrophic shock stripped away the thin skin of culture and sensitivity that humanity has painstakingly accumulated over centuries.
It just evaporated in a matter of seconds.
Exactly. The catastrophe forced an entire region, and this included the rich, the middle class, and the poor who lived there to collapse into antiquity.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning they moved backwards in time to a primitive state of absolute practical survival. When the modern infrastructure of safety vanishes, when the police aren't coming, the hospitals are crushed, and the grocery stores are gone, the modern luxury of prolonged, paralyzing grief vanishes with it. You have to figure out what to do next immediately, or you join the dead.
The absolute bleakness of the choices people make in that state is staggering. There's a story in the notes about a man trapped deep in the debris. His leg is wedged under a massive stone.
Just a nightmare.
He's lying in the dark next to a decaying corpse that, due to the shock and the darkness, he didn't even realize was his own wife. He is begging the soldiers to just chop off his leg with whatever tools they have to get him out.
Wow.
And his relative, who's standing on the surface, pulls a soldier aside and asks them to just kill the trapped man.
To kill him.
Yeah, just give him a lethal injection and save him the misery of a slow death.
And that relative wasn't acting out of malice, right? They were acting out of a brutal, feral mathematics. That is safe mode.
Right.
That is stripping away every modern philosophical debate about medical ethics and boiling existence down to the immediate mitigation of suffering.
But wait, if this feral pragmatism is a temporary state triggered by a once-in-a-century earthquake, How does this connect to the broader question of society and the poor?
This is where the author makes a crucial, devastating observation that transitions us into the core thesis of the entire deep dive. He notes that while everyone rich and poor alike exhibited this feral pragmatism during the aftermath of the earthquake, he had actually seen this exact behavior many times before.
Where?
As he puts it, they were behaving like poor people.
Wow. Okay, that hits hard. We just spent all this time describing the most extreme, mind-altering catastrophe imaginable to explain this intense survival mindset.
Right.
But what you're saying is, for a massive portion of the global population, that isn't a rare disaster response. That is just a Tuesday.
Precisely. The poor do not need a tectonic plate to shift beneath their feet to be thrown into the state of feral pragmatism. As the text frames it, they're ancient people living in our modern times.
That's a heavy thought.
The disaster victims we just talked about, they use these brutal tactics temporarily, just for a few days or weeks, until the state arrives and restores order and infrastructure.
Right, it's a phase.
But the urban and rural poor use these tactics daily because for them, the state never establishes that order in the first place. The emergency is permanent.
So we're saying the daily environment of extreme poverty requires the exact same psychological safe mode as surviving a collapsing building. But surely there has to be some breaking point.
You'd think so.
Like, you mentioned people working in unimaginable conditions. How bad does the day-to-day actually get for this to be a constant state?
To understand the permanence of this catastrophe, you have to look at the bizarre, incredibly grim tragedies that are completely normalized in their daily lives. We are talking about things that would be national scandals in a wealthy suburb, but barely make the back page of a local paper here.
Give me an example.
Dozens of people dying simply from taking cheap, unregulated cold medicine. Mysterious, nameless fevers that sweep through the slums, killing hundreds without ever receiving a formal medical diagnosis.
Because getting a diagnosis requires a functional medical infrastructure that simply isn't accessible to them.
Exactly. Then you have the physical labor, men climbing down into subterranean manholes to manually remove human waste with their bare hands. And routinely being asphyxiated, which is a very clinical, sterile word for a horrific, suffocating death in a sewer.
It's terrifying.
Or you have young men entering a 10-kilometer race in the brutal, blistering heat just to qualify for a low-level police constable job and literally dropping dead on the track from the sheer exertion.
And the notes mention rat miners. For the listener who might not know what that is, what are we talking about here?
Rat mining is a highly dangerous, informal method of coal mining. Because the seams of coal are very thin, it's not economically viable to use large machinery.
So what do?
So instead, they employ humans, often children or very desperate men, to crawl into tiny, unstable crevices in the earth, literally like rats in a maze, to scrape out the coal.
That's just beyond dangerous.
They do this simply because human life in that environment is cheaper to employ and replace than purchasing a robot or an excavator.
It is the ultimate devaluation of human life. It's treating humans as the cheapest available mechanical component.
And perhaps the most darkly ironic example provided in the material is how the poorest of the poor sometimes inadvertently get vaccinated against polio.
Wait, how does that work?
Okay, so the affluent and middle-class populations receive oral polio vaccine drops, which contain a weakened version of the live virus.
Right.
When those people defecate, the weakened virus enters the sewage system. Because the poor often live in areas where their drinking water is severely contaminated with that sewage, they end up ingesting the feces of the affluent.
Oh, that is wow.
In doing so, they ingest the weakened virus and accidentally build immunity. It is a stark, almost unbelievable biological illustration of trickle-down survival. The everyday environment of the poor is as lethal, unpredictable, and raw as the aftermath of an earthquake.
Which brings us to the story of Dana Maggi, which I think perfectly encapsulates this entire ancient mindset concept. Let's really look at this. This happened in August 2016 in the state of Odisha.
Yes.
Dana Maggi is at a government hospital, and his wife, Aman, tragically dies of tuberculosis. She's only 42 years old. The hospital tells him he has to take the body away, but he has absolutely no money to hire a private vehicle to get back to their village, which is 60 kilometers away.
Right.
And the hospital bureaucracy flat out refuses to provide an ambulance or any help. So what does he do?
Well, in a modern mindset, you would expect outrage. You would expect him to demand to see a manager, to stage a sit-in, to call a local journalist, or to start a riot in the lobby.
But he doesn't do any of that. Instead, He expertly wraps his wife's body in cloth. He hoists her onto his own shoulder, and he just starts walking.
It's hard to even picture.
In the stifling heat, he walks for 10 kilometers along the highway, carrying his dead wife. His teenage daughter is walking right beside him, weeping. Occasionally, he has to put his wife's body down on the dirt by the side of the road just to catch his breath and rest his muscles before picking her up and continuing.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Dana Maji's reaction is the purest embodiment of that ancient mindset persisting in the modern world.
How so?
There's a famous photograph of this event, and the author points out a deeply striking visual contrast in it. You see his teenage daughter walking beside him, and she's wearing a salwar kameez, which is a very common, relatively modern-style tunic and trouser outfit.
Okay.
It represents a touch of modern aspiration, but she's standing next to her father, who is engaged in this doubly ancient, almost biblical act of physically carrying a corpse across the landscape because the state has abandoned them.
When a photo like that hits the internet, the modern world goes crazy. We see it and we feel profound, blinding outrage.
Absolutely.
We see a massive structural failure of human rights. We want heads to roll at that hospital.
But the author's point is that Dana Maji himself didn't know he had rights. He wasn't performing a calculated act of civil disobedience against the state.
Right.
He wasn't trying to make a viral political statement.
Exactly. It goes back to the weather. You don't protest a hurricane. You look at Dana Maji and you realize that to him, the hospital, the government, the entire modern infrastructure of the state, it's just weather.
That's exactly it.
You don't get mad at the rain for getting you wet. You don't write a letter to the sky demanding better conditions. You just figure out how to walk through the storm. His reaction was pure feral pragmatism.
The author notes that there was a deep antiquity to his action. It was a profound acceptance that misery is simply inevitable.
Which is so alien to us.
Right. If you look at the ancient world, people didn't believe they were the masters of their own destiny. They conceded that the die was cast against them, that they could be crushed easily by the rich or by nature, and that this misery was essentially the will of the gods.
Which is a very convenient belief system for the people in power, isn't it?
Immensely so. The material mentions a Tamil spiritual speaker in 2024 who addressed an audience of impoverished people, and this speaker told them, point blank, that their current poverty was a direct result of the sins they committed in their past lives.
And they just accepted it.
With the exception of one single man who stood up to object, the audience largely appeared to nod and accept it. To be an ancient person living in a modern era is doubly cruel because you can actually see the riches, the technology, and the modern comforts all around you.
Right, it's not hidden from them.
Exactly. Yet you remain psychologically and physically trapped in that ancient inevitability.
Which brings us right to the central tension of this entire deep dive. If they can see it all, if they can see the Atlantic salmon being flown in, the imported avocados, the air-conditioned luxury SUVs, the private hospitals that actually treat people with dignity, why do they tolerate it?
It's the big question.
Why don't they, as the author bluntly asks, crawl out of their catastrophes, march across the street, and finish us off? If you are a maid being treated like a second-class citizen in a luxury apartment, why aren't you furious at the billionaire who owns it? Why is there peace?
To unravel that, we first have to fundamentally rethink who the poor actually are in this context.
Okay, let's redefine it.
The author is very deliberate about redefining poverty, moving away from how the media or international observers typically categorize it. He points out that we live in a time where almost everyone claims some level of victimhood or financial strain.
Oh, for sure.
Including intellectuals who get priced out of five-star resorts and have to settle for boutique hotels. But more significantly, he asks us to look at the groups we commonly assume are the poor.
Right, like the images we see of people living in cramped one-room chawls in Mumbai, which, for the listener, are these very dense, humid tenement housing blocks where half a dozen people might share a single room.
Yes.
Or think about the massive farmers' protests a few years ago. You had thousands of farmers driving tractors into the capital. It made global news. Rihanna even tweeted about it, asking why nobody was talking about their plight.
The author argues something that might sound controversial to a Western ear. Those people are actually the new middle class of India.
The middle class.
Really?
Yes. The farmers' movement, for instance, was largely an agrarian middle-class movement. They owned land, they owned tractors. Some of those one-room chawls in Mumbai now have split air conditioning units hanging out the window, and the families living in them might own cars that are almost as big as the homes themselves.
So if they are the middle class, what does the actual baseline of poverty look like? Look at the official statistics. If an urban Indian household of 5 people can afford to spend just 7,500 rupees a month, that translates to roughly $90 total for the entire family. For a whole month, they are statistically considered above the poverty line by the government.
$90 a month for 5 people. That is staggering. It is almost incomprehensible.
It really is.
So when the book talks about the poor, it's talking about hundreds of millions of people living vastly below even our most basic, stripped-down comprehension of a safety net.
Correct. And because there are so many people living in that state of extreme, desperate poverty, it actually creates what the author calls a middle-class paradise for everyone else above them.
Wait, explain that. How does massive poverty create a paradise for the middle class?
It is a vital, albeit brutal, economic mechanism. The sheer overwhelming volume of the extremely poor essentially subsidizes the lives of the middle and upper classes.
How so?
Because the poor exist in such massive numbers, their potential for unrest forces the government to heavily subsidize the prices of essentials like water and electricity to prevent mass starvation.
Right.
But who actually consumes the most water and electricity? The rich and the middle class who have multiple air conditioners and large homes, so the affluent get incredibly cheap utilities subsidized in the name of the poor.
I see. That makes sense.
But more importantly, this massive population provides an inexhaustible pool of incredibly cheap human labor. The author mentions sitting in his home, having hired a man to come in and deep clean his bathroom for almost nothing.
Wow.
This is a level of personal service that would cost hundreds of dollars in New York or London. This is why affluent people from these regions often suffer a strange kind of culture shock when they travel to the West. They suddenly lose the subsidy of cheap human labor. They have to clean their own toilets and pump their own gas.
And it creates this incredibly awkward social dynamic back home, right?
Mm.
The material talks about a group it calls the new conscientious sahibs.
Yes, that group.
These are the younger, highly educated, refined middle-class folks. They read the right articles, they hold progressive views, they feel guilty about the inequality, so they change the language.
Of course.
They refuse to use the word servant anymore. They insist on calling them support staff. They post long essays on social media about how cruel it is that maids are historically expected to be invisible in the home.
Yeah.
They want to be seen as nice, enlightened people.
Exactly. But they don't actually want to abolish the job. They don't want to clean their own homes.
Right.
So you end up with the performance of equality without the actual practice of it. They might call the maid support staff, but they still maintain separate, cheaper cutlery in the kitchen just for the staff to use. They won't let the maids use the family's guest bathroom.
There is this haunting visual. The author describes a metaphorical time-lapse video over the last 20 years. He notes how maids in Indian homes have slowly, incrementally soared upward, from being expected to sit completely flat on the floor to eventually being allowed to sit on a small footstool, and maybe, just recently, being allowed to sit on an actual chair.
But the underlying power dynamic,
it remains completely, entirely feudal. The chair doesn't change the fact that they are essentially indentured by poverty.
and despite all this, the highly visible inequality, the daily indignities, the extraction of dirt-cheap labor, the poor, remain largely quiet. There is no mass uprising against the penthouses.
Okay, so we circle back to the giant question, why? Why aren't they rising up?
The author suggests that our entire modern understanding of envy is fundamentally flawed. We think of envy as an upward-looking emotion.
We do.
He brings up Chanakya, an ancient Indian teacher, philosopher, and political strategist. Chanakya claimed that lazy people envy the successful, or that prostitutes envy loyal married women. The author completely disagrees with this framing.
So what does he think?
Instead, he aligns with the ancient Greek poet Hesiod, who famously wrote, "Potter is angry with potter, and craftsman with craftsman."
Potter is angry with potter. Let's spend a second on that, because that is so incredibly true to human nature. I want you, the listener, to think about your own life right now. Think about the last time you felt a pang of intense, burning professional jealousy. Was it aimed at Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk?
Probably not.
They are an abstraction. They exist in a different universe. You envied the colleague sitting in the cubicle next to you who got the 5% raise you asked for.
Exactly.
You envied your cousin who managed to buy a slightly nicer house in a better school district. Envy requires a shared social plane. It is a highly localized emotion. It is a thing between equals.
Precisely. The poor do not look up and envy the billionaire living in a towering glass penthouse. The billionaire is abstract, rather. The poor envy the other poor person next door who somehow managed to buy a secondhand motorcycle.
Right.
They hate the migrant from the neighboring state who comes into their slum and undercuts their daily wages by a few rupees.
So it's horizontal competition.
Yes, and when you actually look at the data on violence, the author observes that the most violent, unjust experiences in the nation are almost entirely horizontal.
Can you elaborate?
Whether it is severe harassment on the streets, horrific caste atrocities occurring among the lower echelons of the caste system, or even the violent decades-long war between the state police and the Naxalite insurgents, which is a Maoist guerrilla rebellion taking place deep in the rural forests, these are overwhelmingly conflicts between the poor and the poorer.
That's heartbreaking.
Poor women face the worst, most frequent harassment from poor men. The local poor's most despised enemy is the poor migrant.
Okay, I want to use an analogy here. Think about how engineers design a massive skyscraper in an earthquake zone. To keep the building from snapping in half, they design it to sway.
Ah, yes.
When a massive force hits the building, the energy is dispersed horizontally. It sways side to side. That horizontal movement acts as a massive shock absorber, dispersing the kinetic energy before it can travel vertically and destroy the foundation.
That is an excellent way to picture it.
All of this horizontal violence and envy among the poor acts exactly like that sway. The sheer kinetic energy of their frustration and misery, which you would logically think should travel vertically, straight up toward the rich, is instead dispersed horizontally, neighbor against neighbor, caste against caste.
Right.
It keeps the bottom layer of society entirely occupied with its own brutal civil war. And because they are fighting each other for scraps, it leaves the top layer perfectly, peacefully safe.
It is a devastatingly effective natural containment system, but importantly, it is not the only thing keeping the affluent safe.
There's more.
Horizontal envy is the psychological barrier, but the author moves on to discuss the active, structural, physical protections that guard the rich. And this is where the observations become quite stark and, frankly, grim regarding how the state actually functions.
Right, because the piece isn't perfectly sealed. Violence does occasionally leak upward. The material mentions a horrific case in the state of Goa, where a friend of the author was tragically raped and murdered by a sacked security guard.
Yes, a terrible tragedy.
So it proves that violent resentment against the upper classes does exist. It can happen, but it is the rare exception. And the reason it remains the exception is because of a deeply brutal, informal justice system.
We have to step back and examine this mechanism purely sociologically, just as the author presents it. We aren't judging the ethics of the state. Here we are looking at the mechanics of its power.
Understood.
He observes that what actually protects the affluent is the most brutal side of the nation's apparatus. In his analysis, the Indian jail system and the notoriously slow judicial process act as a terrifying deterrent in themselves. But beyond the formal legal system, there is a highly effective informal mechanism of what are locally called encounters.
For the listener, an encounter is the local euphemism for an extrajudicial killing by the police. The police claim they had an encounter with a dangerous criminal, a shootout occurred, and the criminal was killed.
Exactly. The book cites a statistic from a news portal, Scroll.in, which claimed there were 813 of these encounter killings in just a 6-year period.
Wait, how does a society simply hide or look past 800 extrajudicial killings? That requires a massive level of collective cognitive dissonance. What is the actual mechanism that allows that to happen without mass riots over police brutality?
The mechanism is collective complicity. According to the author's observations, society at large and even the internal gears of the system itself implicitly cooperate to eliminate certain types of criminals.
Give me an example of how that works.
For example, a morgue doctor might examine a body with a point-blank gunshot wound to the back of the head. But instead of flagging it as an execution, the doctor conveniently interprets it as consistent with a chaotic shootout, signing off on the paperwork.
Unbelievable.
Local journalists might choose not to investigate the inconsistencies in the police report.
Why? Why do they look the other way?
Because there seems to be an unwritten societal line in the sand. If a criminal restricts their violence to the slums, the system is slow and indifferent. But if a criminal crosses the line, if they threaten powerful politicians, if they target the very rich, or if they commit brutal crimes against children, they become a threat to the established order. Once that line is crossed, They are highly likely to be eliminated via an encounter.
Oh.
The mainstream society doesn't seem interested in investigating the civil rights of these specific individuals. The author posits that what the nation cannot achieve with a competent, swift, and fair legal system, it successfully accomplishes through these brutal, informal exterminations. It is a lethal firewall protecting the affluent.
Okay, I have to push back on this, though.
Hmm.
I understand the logic of a brutal deterrent.
Okay.
But a deterrent, whether it's the threat of prison or the threat of an extrajudicial bullet, only works on a rational actor.
Right.
It only works on someone who sits down, calculates the risk versus the reward, and decides the juice isn't worth the squeeze.
That is a very astute observation, and it raises an important question that the book directly addresses. What happens with the completely irrational actors?
Right. What about the desperate addicts, the deeply mentally disturbed, or the sociopaths who don't care if they die? The Goa killer we just mentioned, for example. He murdered someone, stole his victim's ATM card, and then used it immediately at a local machine.
Which is exactly how the police caught him within days.
That is not the calculated action of a rational criminal mastermind. That is pure impulse. So how does the system handle the people who aren't scared of the firewall? Why aren't they causing constant random chaos for the rich?
The author describes an even darker, more passive, natural filtering process that occurs within the extreme underclasses. In his view, people who are clinically dangerous, violently impulsive, or severely mentally ill simply do not survive very long in an environment of extreme poverty.
Wait, the environment itself kills them.
Yes, they are either quickly apprehended or killed by the local community or police because they are a nuisance, or they simply die alone of neglect, starvation, and disease.
That is so bleak.
Think about what it takes to survive in a slum. It requires intense social cooperation, hustling, and a degree of rational pragmatism. An irrational, highly disturbed person cannot maintain that.
So poverty acts as a filter.
Exactly. The author contrasts this with what he calls the more compassionate societies in the U.S. or Western Europe. In those countries, social safety nets, homeless shelters, and emergency medical care actually allow deeply disturbed, potentially dangerous people to survive for years.
Which is obviously a good thing from a humanitarian perspective.
Right, but this inadvertently keeps them in the general population, where they might eventually pose a random threat to affluent citizens on a subway or a street corner. But in the author's grim calculus, the sheer harshness of Indian poverty acts as a ruthless exterminator of these unpredictable, irrational threats long before they can reach the gated communities.
Wow. Okay, so to summarize where we are, the piece is maintained by feral pragmatism, keeping everyone focused on daily survival. Horizontal envy, directing anger at neighbors instead of billionaires.
Yeah.
And a brutal, informal justice system paired with the natural lethality of poverty, filtering out the threats.
It's a very tight system.
That is a heavy structural web.
Hmm.
But the book then takes a fascinating turn into aesthetics. And this concept absolutely blew my mind. The idea that the physical ugliness of the country, the broken infrastructure itself, is actually a stabilizing psychological force.
It is a brilliant, totally counterintuitive observation. To really grasp this, we have to look at the psychological experience of the poor in Western Europe or other highly advanced economies.
Okay, let's do that.
In those countries, the urban centers are often magnificent. You have beautifully preserved ancient architecture, pristine public parks, giant modern cable-stayed bridges, and spectacular, clean public transit. The mainstream society is, in plain sight, highly successful and thriving.
And if you are a poor person living in that environment,
if you are poor, that aesthetic beauty is a constant, mocking reminder of your own failure. The physical environment itself tells you the society has figured it out, there's plenty of wealth, but you are not permitted to have it.
the author uses this incredible phrase to describe this. He says, the poor in a rich, beautiful country are like a bitter Reddit page trapped inside Instagram.
I love that line.
I love that imagery so much. You are constantly surrounded by the curated, physical evidence that you are a loser in the game of life. The nation has succeeded brilliantly, but it deliberately left you behind. That breeds a very specific, volatile kind of resentment.
Exactly, alienation. Now, contrast that visual experience with India. The author points to places like the Arun Jaitley Stadium in Delhi, which he frankly describes as a third-rate, ugly piece of architecture.
A bit harsh, but okay.
He argues that the public chaos, the irregular potholed roads, the unfinished buildings, and the general municipal ugliness convey a very specific, comforting message to the poor. The message is, the nation is poor and struggling, just like you. It hasn't left you behind because it hasn't actually gone anywhere either. We are all in this mess together. The physical reality of the country communicates that most of the nation belongs to the nobodies.
Okay, I have to push back hard on this. I struggle to buy that romanticization. You're telling me a mother living in a slum, trying to get her kids to school, sees a terribly paved road filled with sewage, and feels a warm, comforting sense of belonging,
It sounds absurd when you put it like that.
right? Isn't it far more likely that she just doesn't have the political power or the time to demand a better road? Calling it comforting feels like a rationalization by an intellectual who doesn't actually have to live in the sewage.
That is a very fair critique, and it is a tension the author acknowledges. He admits that he personally hates the disorder and the ugliness, but he is analyzing its sociological function, not defending its morality. He frames it as the reassurance of chaos.
Reassurance of chaos.
You have to look at how people actually interact with the space. You look at the roads, people driving on the wrong side, lanes treated as purely imaginary lines, Google Maps getting utterly confused, and the defining national emotion in these public spaces is surprise.
Surprise.
Yeah. A guy drives like a maniac into oncoming traffic, crashes his scooter, and is completely genuinely stunned that it happened. People casually stroll across a busy, active railway track and are visibly shocked when a massive train appears.
Right, because there's no expectation of strict rules.
Exactly. The author wonders if this constant trial and error of disorder, this friction, is actually something people crave at a deep, unconscious level. He frames this as a cultural tension between what he calls the amateur Indian and the deeply ingrained preference for a crooked line civilization.
Who is the amateur Indian?
The amateur Indian is the highly educated, informed, often English-speaking elite. They read long-form journalism, they talk about sustainability, and they desperately crave Western civic order.
Like perfectly painted crosswalks.
Exactly. They want clear rules, straight lines, and pristine streets. But the author suggests they are amateurs because they don't understand the true nature of their own country. Think about what civic order actually achieves in a first-world European city.
It makes everything efficient.
But it also hides things. The more advanced and orderly an administration is, the more efficiently it hides its humans. Everything is neatly zoned. People stay in their designated lanes behind closed doors. The result is what the author calls the optics of human scarcity.
Yes, that is exactly the reaction you have when you visit a wealthy European suburb or a high-end American neighborhood. You look around the perfectly manicured streets and you think, where are all the people?
It feels sterile.
But the disorder in India prevents that sterility. It converts public spaces into a giant, unpredictable video game where everyone is forced to interact with everyone else.
I can see that. The author shares a very visceral anecdote to illustrate how deeply this is ingrained. He is riding in an Uber on a massive modern 8-lane expressway connecting Delhi to a highly affluent modern suburb. It is a symbol of Western-style progress.
Okay.
But suddenly, the driver simply stops the car in the middle of the journey. He grabs a water bottle, walks to the side of this massive modern expressway, and proceeds to squat and defecate right there by the road.
While the author's just sitting there in the backseat completely helpless, watching the collision of modern infrastructure and ancient behavior.
Exactly.
And he's wondering if economic progress will ever actually erase this deeply distinct line of human behavior.
Right. And the author asks the reader, could that happen in Europe? Could an Uber driver simply stop on the Autobahn to defecate beside it? No. The civic rules and the cultural conditioning are too strong.
Too ingrained.
But he suggests that maybe this immense public disorder, this total inability to hide humanity's messy biological reality, actually saves people from living a sterile, facile, and ultimately dull life.
So what does this all mean for us? For you, the listener, sitting in traffic or walking down a clean sidewalk? I want to challenge you on this. When we demand civic order, when we want clean streets, straight lines, and strict zoning laws, is that secretly just a desire to make the poor invisible?
That is the big question.
Are we just trying to hide the messiness of human survival so we don't have to look at it while we drive our air-conditioned cars from our quiet homes to our quiet offices?
It is a highly uncomfortable question. The author concludes that while the ugliness is objectively terrible, it functions perfectly. It prevents the psychological alienation that sparks revolution. If the public square is ugly, chaotic, and lawless, the poor feel ownership of it, they feel at home.
Okay, so they feel at home in the physical chaos. The ugliness assures them they aren't alone. But surely they still want to escape poverty. The human spirit still has hopes and aspirations for a better life. How does this massive rigged system manage those aspirations without letting the poor actually disrupt the power structure?
Through the masterful, systemic deployment of false hopes and incredibly compelling storytellers, the author points to the institution of higher education as the ultimate grand pacifier of the masses.
How so? Education is usually framed as the great equalizer.
And that framing is exactly why it works so well as a pacifier. The poor are sucked into the powerful, intoxicating idea that if they just study hard enough, pass the right standardized exams, and toe the line of good behavior, they will be offered a fair chance at a better life.
It gives them a goal.
It gives them a tangible goal to focus their energy on, rather than focusing their energy on rebellion.
But it's not entirely a lie, right? People do get degrees, and their lives do get somewhat better than their parents' lives.
They do get marginally better, yes, but the broader game is still entirely rigged at the top. Material success at the highest, most influential levels is largely about entrenched social class, networking, and cultural capital, not just raw intelligence or test scores.
It's about who you know.
The established elite hold all the winning cards in lucrative, power-centric fields like corporate law, investment banking, or the upper echelons of the tech startup world. But the system maintains the illusion of meritocracy because the rich are constantly moving on.
We mean moving on.
As certain professions become accessible to the masses, the elite simply vacate them. They move on to pursue newer intellectual pursuits, avant-garde industries, or, as the author brilliantly phrases it, romanticized forms of unemployment, like becoming an activist, a niche artist, or a podcaster.
Oh, ouch. Feeling a little called out here.
Right. But the educated poor are then allowed to fill those vacated spaces, like becoming mid-level engineers or accountants. It gives the poor the illusion of upward mobility, which keeps them willingly participating in the system rather than burning it down to start over.
Which fundamentally shifts how we view the concept of revolutions. We always have this dramatic historical image of pitchforks and torches, the enraged, starving masses finally breaking down the gates and storming the castle.
Right.
But the book argues that this romanticized idea of a grassroots revolution never actually happens.
Never. The author argues that virtually every successful revolution in history is actually created, sponsored, and directed by the second rung of the elite to trounce the top rung.
Interesting.
It is always a civil war of the top 2% trying to unseat the top 1%. The elites are the ones with the resources, the education, and the strategic vision. They simply use the poor merely as muscle, as foot soldiers and recruits for their own cause. And to recruit them, these aristocratic handlers use the language of morality and justice to mobilize the masses.
And to mobilize the masses effectively, you need a damn good story. This part of the book is absolutely brilliant. Why do the poor consistently vote for sensational politicians? Why do they obsess over abstract issues of religion, caste, or the drama of film stars, rather than demanding things that would actually improve their daily survival?
Because, as the author notes, a story is a corrupt thing. A story isn't just a recounting of an event. It must be an interesting event to capture human attention.
Right.
And what is structurally interesting is rarely what is actually important for daily survival. Sane, sober politicians who promise standardized road design, better municipal hygiene, or a 5% increase in GDP simply cannot compete with the insane, melancholic, or enraged storytellers who tap into deep sensational prejudices and tribal identities.
The author actually asked a prominent politician, Subramanian Swamy, about this. He asked why a nation living in such tough, grinding conditions wastes its immense political energy on obscure, abstract issues of religious identity.
Like whether a temple or a mosque should be built on a specific piece of land.
Exactly. Instead of rioting in the streets demanding air-conditioned public transport, clean water, or good schools. And the answer is tied to the space program.
Yes, the space program analogy is perfect. When international observers ask how a developing country can justify sending rockets to space instead of using that money to eradicate malaria, the dark administrative truth is that rocket science is actually much easier than eradicating poverty.
It's just math and physics.
Exactly. It is significantly easier to build a metal tube, fill it with fuel, and send it into orbit because you are only dealing with physics and a few thousand highly trained engineers than it is to enforce intelligent, standardized road design across an entire chaotic nation of over 1 billion independent, stubborn people.
It makes so much sense.
Similarly, it is easier for a politician to demolish a mosque or build a grand temple than it is to fix the sewer system. The poor are drawn to the esoteric and the dramatic. They will riot over an insult to a film star, but they will patiently step over sewage to drop their kids off at a crumbling public school.
And this craving for a narrative extends to how the poor pursue joy, which is another crucial mechanism of pacification. We often make the mistake of assuming that people in extreme poverty only want utilitarian things for basic survival. We think they only want food, medicine, and shelter.
Which is incredibly condescending.
It is. But they also points out that they are human.
Mm.
They desperately want technology for pleasure. When the mobile phone revolution hit, they didn't adopt smartphones so they could read WebMD for medical advice. They bought them because they wanted to chat, to watch videos, to gossip.
Absolutely.
They want electricity not so they can run medical incubators in their homes, but for the convenience of having light on demand and watching television.
And the people who truly, deeply understand the psychology aren't the government bureaucrats or the Western NGOs. It's the local moneylender.
Moneylenders.
Yes. The book has this fascinating chapter detailing a massive gold loan business run by an old-school patriarch. The staff at these branches are rigorously trained not just to process loans, but to make small talk.
Oh, like a bartender.
Kind of. They are expected to know the customers by name, to ask about their children. If the patriarch walked into a local branch and realized the staff didn't know our regular customer's name, it was considered a deep disgrace to the business.
Because it breaks the illusion of community.
Exactly. This illustrates a profound point about control and compliance. Traditional, feudal interactions can pacify a population far better than sterile, efficient corporate ones. When a moneylender asks about your daughter's wedding while taking your family's gold as collateral at a high interest rate, it creates an emotional bond.
It softens the exploitation.
It does. The moral ideas of family, community, respect, and sacrifice, these are ideas that ultimately favor the rich, keeping the social order stable, but they are deeply enticing to the poor, who wish to emulate those noble values. The rich, who genuinely live out and project these feudal optics, are the most powerful transmitters of the social morals that restrain the poor from revolting.
It's all about who controls the narrative and how we define ourselves against one another. Which brings up this fascinating concept the author borrows from anthropology: symmetric schismogenesis.
Yes, symmetric schismogenesis.
Okay, what does that actually mean in plain English?
It is the psychological and social phenomenon where rival groups begin to define themselves and take on extreme opposite views of each other, simply for the purpose of differentiating themselves from their rivals. It's not about finding the truth, it's about being the opposite of whoever you hate.
Like modern political polarization on social media.
Exactly. If the political tribe you despise says the sky is blue, you will instinctively write a thesis arguing that the sky is actually a construct and it's green. The author uses this concept to critique modern activism.
How so?
He observes how young, educated people can start defining their entire political ideology merely by adopting the exact opposite stance of whoever they personally despise, whether that's an annoying conservative colleague, a demanding corporate boss, or even a traditional spouse.
That's so common.
Their activism isn't always born of deep empathy for the poor. It's born of a desire to distance themselves from the aesthetics of the people they dislike.
Which leads to his incredibly provocative, almost cynical advice for young progressive activists. He basically says that full-time idealism is toxic. He tells the youth to quit their NGOs, stop being full-time professional humanitarians, and go make money instead.
It's very blunt.
It really is. Be highly suspicious of the hypermorality emanating from the West, from woke tech billionaires or elite universities. He literally says, go start a doomed business, engage in commerce, create some jobs, and you'll actually be far more useful to society than you are writing angry essays about inequality.
Again, we are reporting the author's sociological framing here, remaining impartial to the politics of it, but he suggests that the joy of giving, or professional activism, can sometimes function as just another feudal emotional massage.
A feudal emotional massage.
Yes. It is a way for affluent, educated people to feel a sense of self-importance and moral superiority over the miserable, without actually threatening the economic structures that keep them affluent. It's an intoxicant of self-congratulation that ultimately maintains the exact status quo it claims to fight.
So when we pull all these threads together, we are left with a picture of a society at peace. But it isn't really peace at all, is it?
Not at all.
It's a highly engineered, deeply fragile, almost miraculous equilibrium. It is held together by the feral pragmatism of millions of people who are just trying to survive the day, unable to look past tomorrow. It is maintained by horizontal envy, where the structure ensures we fight our neighbors in the dirt instead of looking up at our bosses in the sky.
Right.
It is guarded by a brutal, informal justice system that quietly eliminates the unpredictable threats. It is comforted by a chaotic, ugly physical environment that makes everyone feel like they belong to the same mess. And it is constantly distracted by masterful storytellers who feed us sensationalism, religious drama, and false hopes of meritocracy instead of boring, life-saving infrastructure.
That is the complete anatomy of the piece. The poor don't kill us because the physical, psychological, and social architecture of the world is perfectly, if unconsciously, designed to ensure they don't even think to try.
I want you, the listener, to take a hard look around your own life tomorrow. Look at the support systems you rely on, the way your city is designed, the zoning laws in your neighborhood, the unwritten rules of your workplace, and the things you feel jealous of. How much of it is actually a subtle mechanism designed to keep this fragile piece intact? How much of your reality is just a shock absorber for inequality?
And as we close, there's one final lingering thought derived from the text that we haven't fully explored, but that completely reframes everything we've just spent the last hour discussing. We spend so much time analyzing the billionaires at the very top and the extreme poor at the very bottom. But what about the upper middle class? What about the people listening to this right now?
Right. The book poses this brilliant, deeply disturbing question about human nature itself. If the fundamental objective of any family, regardless of whether they are rich, middle class, or struggling, is to provide an unfair advantage to their own children through social contacts, expensive tutors, better schools, and exclusive clubs, is the very concept of equality fundamentally at odds with human nature.
Are we all just endlessly chasing our own localized inequality? The author asks if what we call social inequality is really just a hypocritical complaint by the 98th percentile against the 99th, mere millionaires loathing multimillionaires while fiercely protecting their advantages from the middle class.
It makes you wonder.
It suggests that the drive to be unequal, to be securely better positioned than the person sitting next to you, isn't a glitch in the system. It is the engine of the entire human experience, something for you to deeply mull over.
It really is. Imagine again that your world instantly collapses. The floor drops out, the rubble settles, the dust clears. When you forcefully strip away the Wi-Fi, the boutique hotels, the ideological debates, the political tribalism, and the performance of morality, what are you actually left with?
Just the raw truth.
Just the raw, feral instinct to find a stepping stone to survive, and the desperate hope that someone else doesn't use you as theirs. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you.